I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, in a world turned upside down, this General Assembly Hall is among the strangest sights of all. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed our annual meeting beyond recognition, but it has made it more important than ever. In January, I addressed the General Assembly and identified 4 horsemen in our midst for threats that endanger our common future. First, the highest global geostrategic tensions in years. Second, an existential climate crisis. Third, deep and growing global mistrust. And fourth, the dark side of the digital world. But the 5th horseman was lurking in the shadows. Since January, the COVID-19 pandemic has galloped across the globe, joining the 4 other horsemen and adding to the fury of each. And every day, the grim toll grows, families grieve, societies stagger, and the pillars of our world wobble on already shaky footings. We face simultaneously an epochal health crisis, the biggest economic calamity and job losses since the Great Depression, and dangerous new threats to human rights. COVID-19 has laid bare the world's fragilities, rising inequalities, climate catastrophe, widening societal divisions, rampant corruption. The pandemic has exploited these injustices, preyed on the most vulnerable, and wiped away the progress of decades. For the first time in 30 years, poverty is rising. Human development indicators are declining, and we are careening off track in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Meanwhile, nuclear non-proliferation efforts are slipping away, and we are failing to act in areas of emerging danger, particularly cyberspace. People are hurting, our planet is burning. Our world is struggling, stressed, and seeking real leadership and action. Excellencies, we face a foundational moment. Those who built the United Nations 75 years ago had lived through a pandemic, a global depression, genocide, and world war. They knew the cost of discord and the value of unity. They fashioned a visionary response embodied in our founding charter with people at the center. Today, we face our own 1945 moment. The pandemic is a crisis unlike any we have ever seen. But it is also the kind of crisis that we will see in the different forms again and again. COVID-19 is not only a wake-up call, it's a dress rehearsal for the world of challenges to come. We must move forward with humility, recognizing that the microscopic virus has brought the world to its knees, and we must be united. We have seen when countries go in their own direction, the virus goes in every direction. We must act in solidarity. Far too little assistance has been extended to countries with the fewest capacities to face the challenge. And we must be guided by science and tethered to reality. Populism and nationalism have failed. Those approaches to contain the virus have often made things manifestly worse. Too often, there has also been a disconnect between leadership and power. We see remarkable examples of leadership, but they are not usually associated with power. And power is not always associated with the necessary leadership. In an interconnected world, it is time to recognize a simple truth. Solidarity is self-interest. If we fail to grasp that fact, everyone loses. Excellencies, as the pandemic took hold, I called for a global ceasefire. Today, I appeal for a new push by the international community to make this a reality by the end of this year. We have exactly 100 days. There is only one winner of conflict during a pandemic, the virus itself. And my original appeal was endorsed by 108 member states, along with religious leaders, religious partners, civil society networks, and others. And the number of armed movements also responded, from Cameroon to Colombia to the Philippines and beyond, even if several of the ceasefires they announced were not sustained. Enormous obstacles stand in the way. Deep mistrust, spoilers, and the weight of fighting that has festered for years. But we have reasons to be hopeful. A new peace agreement in the Republic of the Sudan between the government and armed movements marks the start of a new era, particularly for people living in Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile. In Afghanistan, the launch of the Afghanistan peace negotiations is a milestone after years of effort. How to reach a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire will be on the agenda. An inclusive peace process with women, young people, and victims of conflict, meaningfully represented, offers the best hope for a sustainable solution. In several situations, we have seen new ceasefires holding better than in the past, or in their absence, a standstill in the fighting. In Syria, the ceasefire in Idlib is largely intact. After more than 9 years of conflict and colossal suffering, I renew my appeal for an end to hostilities across the country as we work towards convening the next round of the Constitutional Committee. In the Middle East, with a period of relative calm in Gaza and annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank put aside, at least for the time being, I urge Israeli and Palestinian leaders to re-engage in meaningful negotiations that will realize a two-state solution in line with relevant UN resolutions, international law, and bilateral agreements. In Libya, fighting has subsided, but the massive build-up of mercenaries and weapons in flagrant violation of Security Council resolutions shows the risk of renewed confrontation remains high. We must all work together for an effective ceasefire agreement and the resumption of intra-Libyan political talks. In Ukraine, the most recent ceasefire regime remains in place, but progress on the outstanding security and political issues under the Trilateral Contact Group and the Normandy 4 format to implement the Minsk agreements will be critical. In the Central African Republic, last year's peace deal helped deliver a significant reduction in violence. Under the auspices of our UN peacekeeping mission and with the backing of the international community, the national dialogue is underway to support upcoming elections and continue the implementation of the peace agreement. And in South Sudan, we have seen a troubling spike in intercommunal violence, but the ceasefire between the two main parties has mostly had, with our UN peacekeeping mission providing support for monitoring as well as implementation of the peace agreement. Now, even where conflict is raging, we will not give up the search for peace. In Yemen, we are fully engaged in bringing the parties together to reach an agreement on the joint declaration comprised of a national ceasefire, economic and humanitarian confidence-building measures, and the resumption of the political process. Excellencies, in areas where terrorist groups are particularly active, the obstacles to peace will be much more difficult to overcome. In the Sahel and the Lake Chad region, we see the pandemic's overlapping health, socioeconomic, political, and humanitarian impacts at play. I'm particularly concerned that terrorist and violent extremist groups will exploit the pandemic. And we must not forget the dramatic humanitarian cost of war. In many places, the pandemic, coupled with conflict and disruption, is dealing crippling blows to food security. Millions of people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Northeast Nigeria, South Sudan, as well as Yemen, face the risk of famine. Now is the time for a collective new push for peace and reconciliation. And so I appeal for a stepped-up international effort led by the Security Council to achieve a global ceasefire by the end of this year. We have 100 days, as I said, the clock is ticking. The world needs a global ceasefire to stop all hot conflicts. But at the same time, we must do everything to avoid a new Cold War. We are moving in a very dangerous direction. Our world cannot afford a future where the two largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules and internet and artificial intelligence capacities. A technological and economic divide risks inevitably turning into a geostrategic and military divide, and we must avoid these at all costs. Excellencies, in the face of the all-encompassing challenge of the pandemic, the United Nations has mounted a comprehensive response. The UN system, led by the World Health Organization, has supported governments, particularly in the developing world, to save lives and contain the spread of the virus. Our global supply chains have helped to provide personal protective equipment and other medical supplies to more than 130 countries. We have extended life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable countries and people, including refugees and those internally displaced, through a global humanitarian response plan. And we have mobilized the full UN system in development emergency mode, activated our UN country teams, and rapidly issue policy guidance to support governments. The Verified campaign is fighting misinformation online, a toxic virus shaking the democratic underpinnings in many countries. We are working to advance treatments and therapies as a global public good and backing efforts for a people's vaccine available and affordable everywhere. We know some countries are reportedly making side deals exclusive for their own populations. Such vaccine nationalism is not only unfair, it is self-defeating. None of us is safe until all of us are safe. Everybody knows that. Likewise, economies cannot run with a runaway pandemic. Since the beginning, we have pushed for a massive rescue package worth at least 10% of the global economy. Now, developed countries have provided enormous relief for their own societies, and they can afford it. But we need to ensure that the developing world does not fall into financial ruin, escalating poverty, and debt crisis. We need a collective commitment to avoid a downward spiral. 1 week from today, we will bring together world leaders to find solutions at a meeting on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. And in all we do, we are putting a special focus on women and girls. Half of humanity is bearing the brunt of the social and economic consequences of COVID-19. Women are disproportionately represented in the sectors hit hardest by job losses. Women do most of the unpaid care work generated by the pandemic, and women have fewer economic resources to fall back on because their wages are lower and they have less access to benefits. At the same time, millions of young girls are losing their chance of an education and a future as schools close and child marriage is on the rise. Unless we act now, gender equality could be set back by decades. We must also stamp out the horrifying increase in violence against women and girls during the pandemic, from domestic violence to sexual abuse, online harassment, and femicide. This is a hidden war on women. Preventing and ending it requires the same commitment and resources that we devote to other forms of warfare. Excellences, au-delà des mesures d'urgence, les efforts de relance d'aujourd'hui doivent jeter les bases d'un monde meilleur pour demain. Cette relance est notre chance de réinventer les économies et les sociétés. Nous avons les feuilles de route, la Charte des Nations Unies, la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, le programme 2030 et l'accord de Paris. La relance doit renforcer la résilience. Au niveau national, cela exige un nouveau contrat social et sur le plan international, un nouveau pacte mondial. Ce nouveau contrat social doit permettre de bâtir des sociétés inclusives et durables. L'inclusion implique d'investir dans la cohésion sociale et de mettre fin à toutes les formes d'exclusion, de discrimination et de racisme. Elle suppose de mettre en place une nouvelle génération de politiques de protection sociale, comprenant notamment la couverture sanitaire universelle et la possibilité d'un revenu minimum universel. L'inclusion consiste également à donner à toutes et à tous l'accès à l'éducation et à tirer parti des technologies numériques, les deux grands vecteurs d'autonomisation et d'égalité de notre époque. Cela requiert des systèmes fiscaux auxquels tout le monde, particuliers comme entreprises, contribue équitablement. Il s'agit de placer les droits humains au cœur de nos efforts dans la droite ligne de l'appel à l'action en faveur des droits humains que j'ai lancé cette année à Genève. Cela signifie l'égalité des droits et des chances pour les femmes et les filles. La pandémie a plus de jamais révélé l'inefficacité des femmes lorsqu'elles tiennent les rênes. 25 ans après Pékin, la génération actuelle de filles doit être en mesure de réaliser ses ambitions et son potentiel illimité. Mesdames et messieurs, pour être véritablement durable, le nouveau contrat social doit assurer la transition vers les énergies renouvelables et ainsi atteindre l'objectif de zéro émission nette d'ici à 2050. Je demande à tous les pays d'envisager d'inclure 6 mesures positives pour le climat dans les efforts qu'ils déploient pour sauver, reconstruire et relancer leurs économies. Premièrement, nous devons rendre les sociétés plus résilientes et rechercher une transition juste. Deuxièmement, nous avons besoin d'emplois verts et d'une croissance durable. Troisièmement, les plans de sauvetage de l'industrie, de l'aviation et du transport maritime devraient être assortis de conditions de conformité aux objectifs de l'accord de Paris. Quatrièmement, il faut mettre un terme aux subventions aux combustibles fossiles. Cinquièmement, il est impératif de tenir compte des risques climatiques dans toutes les décisions financières et politiques. Et sixièmement, il faut agir ensemble sans laisser personne de côté. Mais pour réduire véritablement les fragilités et les risques, et pour mieux résoudre les problèmes que nous avons en commun, nous avons également besoin d'un nouveau pacte mondial au niveau international. Ce nouveau pacte doit permettre de garantir que les systèmes politiques et économiques mondiaux fournissent les biens publics essentiels à toutes les populations. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas le cas. Les structures de gouvernance et les cadres éthiques sont marqués par de profondes lacunes. Pour y remédier, nous devons veiller au partage large et équitable du pouvoir, des richesses et des opportunités. Le nouveau pacte mondial doit reposer sur une mondialisation juste, fondée sur les droits et la dignité de chaque être humain, sur la vie en harmonie avec la nature et sur nos responsabilités envers les générations futures. Nous devons intégrer les principes du développement durable dans tous les processus décisionnels afin d'orienter les flux des ressources vers l'économie verte, durable et équitable. Et les systèmes financiers mondiaux doivent évoluer dans cette direction. Le commerce doit être libre et juste, sans subventions perverses ni barrières qui défavorisent les économies en développement. Le nouveau pacte mondial doit aussi s'attaquer aux injustices historiques des structures de pouvoir sur la planète. Plus de 70 ans après leur création, les institutions multilatérales doivent être modernisées afin de représenter plus équitablement tous les peuples du monde, plutôt que de conférer un pouvoir disproportionné à certains et de limiter l'influence des autres, surtout du monde en développement. Excelências, não necessitamos novas burocracias. Necesitamos um sistema multilateral que inove constantemente, beneficie a las personas y proteja nuestro planeta. El multilateralismo del siglo XXI debe actuar en red, debe ser capaz de vincular a través de los diferentes ámbitos sectoriales y áreas geográficas a las instituciones globales, desde los bancos de desarrollo a las organizaciones regionales, pasando por las distintas alianzas comerciales. El multilateralismo del siglo XXI debe ser inclusivo, debe abrir la participación a un círculo mucho más amplio de actores, aprovechando las capacidades de la sociedad civil, las regiones y ciudades, las empresas, las fundaciones y las instituciones académicas y científicas. Es así como organizaremos un multilateralismo efectivo a la altura de los desafíos del siglo XXI. Dear friends across the world, we cannot respond to this crisis by going back to what was or withdrawing into national shells. To overcome today's fragilities and challenges, we need more international cooperation, not less. Strengthen multilateral institutions, not a retreat from them. Better global governance, not a chaotic free-for-all. The pandemic has upended the world, but that upheaval has created space for something new. Ideas, once considered impossible, are suddenly on the table. large-scale action no longer seems so daunting. In just months, billions of people have fundamentally changed how they work, consume, move, and interact. Large-scale financing has suddenly proven possible, as trillions have been deployed to rescue economies. In commemorating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the General Assembly has invited me to report on our common agenda for the future. I welcome this opportunity for a process of profound reflection involving us all. And I will report back next year with analysis and recommendations on how we can reach our shared aims. Let us draw inspiration from our achievements across the history of the United Nations. Let us respond affirmatively to the movements of justice and dignity we see in the world. And let us vanquish the 5 horsemen and build the world we need, peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable. The pandemic has taught us that our choices matter. As we look to the future, let us make sure we choose wisely. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his presentation. The General Assembly will now turn to Agenda Item 8, entitled General Debate. I will deliver a statement as the President of the General Assembly from the rostrum. Heads of State and Government, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished ministers and delegates, Excellencies, I am honored to welcome you all to the general debate of the 75th session of the General Assembly. I would like to take a moment to commemorate this historic occasion. This hall has been the background of many significant discussions. Here in this hall, the General Assembly has accomplished much. We have reached consensus, and we have resolved difficult problems. This hall symbolizes that the nations can accomplish when they are united. And here in this hall, the general debate has been the apex of our deliberations. The general debate and the high-level week enable our political and civil society leaders to come together and discuss the various challenges we face. Some of these challenges are local or regional, but our efforts are always global. Excellencies, this year, in this hall, the general debate has had to take a new form. The leaders of our nations are not personally present. They will not be able to interact with each other and have bilateral meetings on the sidelines. And there is limited opportunity to benefit from NGO participation. But our need for deliberation is higher than ever. The pandemic has affected far more than our ability to attend this debate in person. It has pummeled our economies. It has pushed our healthcare systems to their limits. Education has been disrupted, risking our collective future. The most vulnerable have suffered most. The already precarious situation of refugees and migrants is ever more dire. The women and girls face higher risks of exposure to gender-based violence and exploitation. Children are more at risk of child labor, child marriage, and trafficking. Xenophobia, racism, and discrimination on ethnic and religious grounds are on the rise. Violence against members of religious groups and places of worship have been increasing. I wish to extend my sympathy and solidarity to each and every individual who has been impacted by this virus. And on behalf of all these people, I want to make a call. Rarely has the whole of humanity faced such an imminent and common threat. Today, we must leave our differences and disagreements aside. Today, we must renew our collective commitment to multilateralism. Today, we must combine our efforts to address this global problem, and we must make sure that no one is left behind. We, the peoples of the United Nations, can achieve this. Excellencies, when we consider the potential of the United Nations, it is important to consider this organization's origins. Following the heinous act of the World War II, the establishment of the United Nations was an acknowledgement that we must do better. It was a collective commitment to the progress of humanity. Through a new rules-based world order, with an organization of unrivaled legitimacy at its center, our founders endeavored to ensure peace, prosperity, and progress for all. The system was designed to be flexible, so we can address a range of challenges and unexpected issues. To recover from the pandemic, we can plan, innovate, and build back better for a sustainable, inclusive, and just recovery. Doing this alone will cost more lives and more resources. The pandemic will continue to change how we operate over the next year. We must make full use and all the tools available to us to combat this challenge. And a key platform to provide political guidance to our efforts at the international level is this very assembly, where we all sit today, the main deliberative, policy-making, and representative organ of the United Nations. In this regard, I urge member states to be cooperative and creative, to devise solutions that will enable this body to function effectively and remain relevant within the bounds of the Charter of Rules and Procedure. Excellencies, since 1945, our demands of the United Nations system have grown immeasurably. Today, the United Nations supports international peace and security in some of the world's most volatile regions, with its force of 95,000 peacekeepers in 13 operations around the world. It coordinates an appeal of tens of billions of US dollars to meet the humanitarian needs of tens of millions of people around the world. It supplies vaccines to 50% of the world's children, preventing the spread of disease and saving 3 million lives a year. The Human Rights Council and the treaty body system is responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe. The pandemic has only increased our demands on the system. To meet them, the organization and this General Assembly in particular will need to enhance coordination, coherence, efficiency, and delivery capacity within its work and its relation to other organs. We must adapt, making space for further engagement among them across the three pillars of our work. We must continue to strengthen the efforts of UN agencies, including the World Health Organization, to combat this pandemic. We must be prepared to have tough, honest conversation about where the multilateral system is failing or where it is not adapting fast enough to the ever-evolving challenges we face. And we need to act to implement the necessary reforms to ensure that UN is fit for purpose and can deliver the future we want. Excellencies, in our efforts, let us put the people we serve front and center. Our UN Charter is a product of we the peoples of the United Nations. Let us consider these people as individuals with varied circumstances and challenges, hopes and dreams. Let us think about an IDP who was finally able to start school at age 11. Her education is now being threatened by the pandemic as schools shut down and families face increasing economic hardship. Let us picture a refugee who lost all her 10 animals to a pulmonary epidemic, impacting financial and nutrition levels for her whole family. And let us consider a victim of a terrorist attack who will need long-term physical, psychological, social, and financial support to deal with the trauma. These people need our helping hand. These people need to see that they are not alone. The people we serve recognize that the multilateral system is the best system available to provide solutions to complex issues such as climate change, peace and security, human rights protections, and global pandemics. With the individuals we serve at the forefront, let me now outline my priorities for this session that I hope you will support. Firstly, as we commemorate the UN's 75th anniversary, we must recommit to and strengthen multilateralism and acknowledge its achievements. The UN is the world's foremost forum to address issues that transcend national boundaries, maintain international peace and security, promote sustainable and inclusive development, and protect human rights. Multilateralism is essential to fulfill the core mandates of our organization, prescribed in its charter. To do that, we must continue to seek ways in order to establish and consolidate trust and cohesion among members, groups of countries, and other stakeholders. Today, the world is seeing rising levels of mistrust and rivalry between major powers. International institutions succeed when they manage to mediate such tensions. The UN was born with this in mind. It is in the interests of the world, our economies, and our people that these tensions are managed and do not spiral out of control. The forum provided by the United Nations is critical to reinforce cooperation and consensus. Secondly, I will endeavor to advance the humanitarian agenda of our organization in view of the unprecedented level of humanitarian needs which are caused by prolonged and new conflicts, as well as natural disasters around the world. We currently serve over 100 million people, including many refugees in my own country and other countries who have fled the devastating wars. Our efforts must ensure that the most vulnerable are protected and able to live in dignity as set out in the UN Charter. The pandemic has only intensified existing vulnerabilities and inequalities. We must work doubly hard to protect these already vulnerable populations from further hardship. We have a collective responsibility to demonstrate that we can deliver, especially for those in the most dire situations. I will use my presidency to highlight the importance of impartial and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid and full respect for international law, including international humanitarian law in conflicts and crises. I would also like to take this moment to recognize the admirable dedication of UN personnel who operate in some of the world's most difficult circumstances and are a critical driving force of this organization's success. Thirdly, sustainable development goals are the most transformative set of objectives, yet they cannot be achieved without strengthened global partnership. As we begin the decade of action and delivery for implementation of the SDGs, all of us, member states, international financial organizations, private sector, and civil society, need to renew efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda. Despite hard-won gains, we are not on track to meet all 17 of the SDGs by 2030. The pandemic has affected all countries, large and small, north and south. It has, however, hit hardest the countries that are already vulnerable. We must ensure that our efforts to recover from pandemic are fully aligned with the implementation of the SDGs. If we are to uphold our pledge to leave no one behind, we must redouble our efforts in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, with a particular attention to the needs of the countries in special situations, including the LDCs. COVID vaccines must be distributed fairly and equitably. And finally, on gender equality, despite the enormous gains that have been made, gender inequality remains deeply entrenched in many societies. Women often lack access to decent work, equal pay, quality education, and adequate health care. They suffer from violence and discrimination and are often underrepresented in political and economic decision-making processes. As we recover from the pandemic, we must build back better to improve the lives of women and girls. We must renew our commitment to protect women's rights and make women's participation in peace, security, and humanitarian action meaningful and sustained. The high-level meeting to mark the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women will mark the beginning of our work this session to address the deeply entrenched inequality which permeates society and holds back the progress of not just half, but all of the population. Excellencies, 3/4 of a century ago, the founders of our organization demonstrated fortitude at a time of crisis. They chose to trust one another and unite in pursuit of a better world. Together we have overcome adversity and challenges. Let us draw strength from those who have preserved in the past. When we have worked together, humanity has prevailed. As we tackle the pandemic, poverty, inequality, climate change, and many other global challenges, I implore you to remember 2 points. Firstly, to use this organization to its fullest potential. And secondly, to come together for the benefit of all. I wish you every success in these worthy endeavors. I have full faith that you will do your utmost to continue to serve the people you are privileged to represent. As the president of this body, I stand ready to facilitate your efforts. This assembly has the power to create a better world for all. This has been a historical year already, and together we will make this session a historical success. Thank you very much.